Hello again. Home Secretary Yvette Cooper has got it into her head that disliking women or being prejudiced against them is tantamount to terrorism. She is encouraged in this spectacularly peculiar worldview by the Commissioner of Police for the Metropolis, Mark Rowley, who, like the Home Secretary, is a bit of a loony. He says that violence against women and girls should be treated as a national security threat. Both of these views are utterly mad. Before going any further, it might be helpful to see what terrorism actually is and whether or not it might overlap with misogyny, which is one of Yvette Cooper's hobby horses. Looking at the definition of terrorism currently used by the British government might help us decide how to describe the activities of misogynist men. According to this definition, taken from the Terrorism Act 2000, terrorism is the use or threat of action designed to influence the government, to intimidate the public or a section of the public, made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause, and involving serious violence against a person, serious damage to property, the threat to a person's life, or a serious risk to the health or safety of the public. Misogyny simply means dislike of, contempt for, or prejudice against women. Now, nobody could deny that in some very rare cases, misogyny can involve serious violence against a person. But this is violence which is seldom made for the purpose of advancing a political, religious, racial, or ideological cause. In other words, there may well be, and probably are, many men in this country who are misogynists, and a tiny number of them will go on to beat up, rape, and even occasionally murder women. But in doing so, they are not following any coherent ideology. The man who slaps a woman's eye when he's been drinking or who strangles his wife is rather driven by internal feelings of rage and perhaps inadequacy. He hasn't been motivated by some political group or religion to behave in this way. There have always been wife beaters, killers, and rapists, even before the internet was devised and people began to use social media. Yvette Cooper, though, is convinced that young men are being radicalized by influencers such as Andrew Tate and are drawn into a network which propagates hatred of and contempt for women. These men are not infrequently incels, that is to say, those who are involuntarily celibate. They are, in fact, men who would like a girlfriend, but who are either too unattractive in physical appearance or too inept socially to acquire one. These people supposedly often then start to hate women and plot violence against them. This puts them, according to both the Home Secretary and the head of the police in London, in the same category as Islamist terrorists. I hope that I have fairly expressed the essence of this new move, which is really, of course, just another strand of the government's attack on social media. Andrew Tate's name keeps popping up, and so does talk of online radicalisation. The fact is, of course, that there have always been men who hate women and feel uneasy around them. This has nothing at all to do with social media, it's an old theme. We may find such views abhorrent, but and we may wish that they did not exist. But to equate them with terrorism or suggest that they are a product of radicalisation caused by a few loudmouth men on the internet is pretty mad by anybody's standards. The idea that the Home Secretary and the Commissioner of Police are both espousing is that if we crack down on social media and arrest people for things which they say on TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, then we will be able to prevent disorder on the streets and reduce the amount of violence inflicted on women. It's a grand idea, of course, if completely mad. There was no internet in Victorian Britain, and yet wife beating and marital rape were both accepted as perfectly normal pastimes. This was the age, of course, which produced perhaps the greatest and most violent misogynist the world has ever seen, Jack the Ripper. It is not online influencers who cause this kind of thing, but rather the views of society on what is acceptable and what we view with horror and detestation. The idea that if we could somehow switch off social media, Britain would be a safer place for women is an odd one. And that we now have a Home Secretary who subscribes to such a notion is alarming in the extreme, because the only real result of it will be yet more restrictions on our ability freely to express our views on the internet. It certainly will not prevent violent men from striking women or sexually abusing them or even sometimes murdering them.